Up until now, we learned about HTML, the DOM, and CSS. When we were learning about the DOM, we also peeked a little bit into JavaScript and saw how it manipulates the DOM nodes by changing the font color and size. In this video, we'll look more into JavaScript so that we can better understand how it works and how to use it. JavaScript is one of the most popular programming languages, and it's essential for web development, meaning that anybody who wants to be a web developer should be familiar with it. Because it's so important, all browsers that we commonly use come with a JavaScript engine, which means that they all know how to read and interpret JavaScript and render it into a web page without you having to install anything else. That's why there is a JavaScript console in the Chrome web development tools. With this console, you can do things with JavaScript like making the browser show some text or make one of those annoying pop-ups. I just wanted to show you that the JavaScript engine is built into the web browser. Normally, you wouldn't be writing scripts with this. If you want the browser to read JavaScript, you can put the script into a separate file, which we can source into the HTML. Or we can also write the script directly onto the HTML file between the script tags. Just make sure you don't do both at the same time, because if you add a source attribute to the script tag, the browser will ignore whatever is between the tags. You can have multiple script tags in one HTML document, and it doesn't matter where you place it in the head or the body. Just like any other programming language, you can declare variables and assign them to a value. Here, we create an integer, but it could be floats, booleans, arrays, or strings. You will also be able to use operators to do calculations on these variables and also write functions. A JavaScript function is a block of code that performs a certain task. Most of the cases, you would write several statements in a function and call this function whenever something happens in the web page. We'll look into this a bit more later in this video when we're learning about events. In JavaScript, you can also use conditions with if and switch, and use loops with for loops and while loops. If you have basic programming knowledge or you're familiar with another language, it won't be difficult to get used to the JavaScript syntax because you can always search Google or go to the documentation. Even the most experienced programmers need to constantly check the documentation when they are using a new language. I won't be explaining the very details for the syntax for JavaScript, but in this video, I will teach you the 3 most important tasks that you need to know how to do when you're dealing with the DOM. 1. Selecting an element. 2. Making changes to that element. And then 3. Handling events. First, selecting elements. In a previous lesson, I showed you how JavaScript was able to manipulate the DOM elements. We changed the color of a P element and then changed the size of another one. But haven't you wondered how we were able to target each element? Actually, we've done something like this before in the tutorials. We gave an ID to each of the elements and selected that to change the style when we were writing CSS. We are going to do something similar to that in JavaScript by using this method, getElementById. We give the element an ID with the ID attribute in the HTML. And then in the script, we say document.getElementById and pass in the ID of the element we want to select in double quotes. Document represents the DOM. When the browser loads the HTML, it becomes a document object, which is the root of the DOM. And this little dot is called property accessor, which you can use to get the property or methods under an object. GetElementById is a method under the document object, so we use a dot notation to access it. You can check what other methods you can use in the documentation if you search for getElement. You can also see getElementByClassName, getElementByName, getElementByTagName. So you can see that there are other ways to select an element. Another method that you can use to select elements is querySelector and querySelectorAll, which lets you select elements like a CSS selector. So we've selected an element, and now what? This code right now is doing nothing. This brings us to the second task, changing the elements. We just saw that the dot notation lets us access the properties of an object. What we just selected here, which is the P element with the ID first, is also an object, which means we can put another dot to it and access its properties. The style property of this object lets us set or return the style attributes. If you want to change the color of the selected element, you just need to put dot color and set it to a different color, orange. So now we know how to select and manipulate the DOM. But if we put this script to the HTML and run it on the browser, it would just show the results. If we want to make the browser interactive, wouldn't we have to put some kind of conditions like when I click this, do this, when I scroll down or do that? This is where I start talking about events. The general meaning of an event would simply mean something that happens, which is actually similar to what it means in programming. In programming, an event is a change of state that can trigger a behavior in the program. In our case, when an event is made by the user, it would be something like a mouse click, pressing a key on the keyboard, or shaking on a mobile phone. These are all actions done by the user that will trigger certain behaviors on the website. For example, if we want to expand this menu by clicking this arrow, clicking the arrow is the event, and that event will be handled in JavaScript that calls the function that manipulates the DOM to make the menu appear on the web page. Every element in the DOM has a set of events that can trigger JavaScript. I'll show you how this would look like in HTML. I'm going to make a pop-up window just like I did before, but instead of typing it in the console, I'm going to make a button so that when the user clicks that button, a window will pop up. After making the pop button, I'm going to write a function that can make the pop-up window go off. Just to be simple, I will be writing JavaScript directly onto the HTML using the script tags. Inside here will be the JavaScript that calls the annoying pop-up function. And if I want to call this function every time the user clicks this button, I can do that by adding an onClick attribute to the button tag. Then, for the value, I'll write the script that calls the function. This way, whenever a user clicks on the button, it will call the annoying pop-up function. If we change the attribute to onMouseOver instead of onClick, the window will pop up just by hovering over the button. But this is not the best way to handle events because you would need to add an attribute inside the button tag. Keeping the HTML and JavaScript separate would be a better practice, so we will use something called an event listener. You can do this by selecting the element, then add a method called addEventListener, then pass in the event, which is click, and the function to call. If you use the addEventListener method, you can put multiple functions on one event, and also put multiple events on one element. So far, we learned how to do the three main tasks: select elements, change them, and handle events. We are looking at a very simple example, but when you're dealing with a complex website with many more elements, the JavaScript can get a bit lengthy to write and manage. This is why many people use jQuery. It is a JavaScript library that makes it much easier to write code. If you source jQuery to the HTML, you are able to write JavaScript in a simplified form. This is possible because the jQuery library predefined a lot of the commonly used tasks. For example, if you use jQuery to simplify the example like this, and it will still do the same thing. We'll learn about how to use jQuery in the tutorials as we finish the to-do list project. I'll see you then.